All right, we ready? So we are continuing our series of portraits in the Old Testament. We've heard sermons from Bruce, Murray, and Lynette so far. Nice arms you've got there, Bruce. So I wasn't here last week, but I watched the recording of my mum's sermon. Wasn't she brilliant? She did so well. So she told the story of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, and how their story shows God's chesed, or merciful love, and how we can rely on God to faithfully and lovingly work out his plans in our lives when we are experiencing mess or even tragedy. Today I'm building on a related theme in the story of Joshua, the theme of God's justice and mercy. And as a quick side note, I want to acknowledge all the graphics you'll see are from the Bible Project, and my dear husband David spent hours finding them for me. This is a definite team effort PowerPoint. So I feel a bit of weight on my shoulders talking about the story of Joshua, because it's actually some of the most criticized and controversial content in the Bible. I know at least one person who walked away from her Christian faith because of it. Maybe you know someone with a similar story. But in this story, there is so much to learn about the beauty and goodness of God and his plan to rescue us. So I'm excited that today we get to wrestle with it instead of glossing over it. So Joshua was the leader of Israel after Moses. His story starts in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and the rest is told in the book of Joshua. In the story of Ruth we heard last week, the people of Israel were already settled in the Promised Land. The story of Joshua happens about 200 years earlier, when the Israelites don't yet have a land of their own. So let's remember Joshua's context. Abraham's grandson Jacob, also known as Israel, moved to Egypt with his whole family and had so many descendants there that they became a nation, just as God had promised Abraham. Eventually, the Egyptians felt threatened. And for about 400 years, they made the Israelites do slave labor to keep them under control, until God selected Moses to confront Pharaoh with miraculous power to demand, "Let my people go." God supernaturally delivers Israel from Egypt by parting the Red Sea for them to walk through and drowning Pharaoh's pursuing army. At this point, Israel is a young, clueless nation. They don't yet know how to be anything other than slaves. But God makes a covenant with them and gives them commands to live by through his representative, Moses. And Moses leads the people through the desert to the land God had promised to Abraham's descendants, the land of Canaan. Moses sends in 12 spies to check out the land. And they come back saying, "This is an amazing place. It's beautiful, it grows great food, it basically flows with milk and honey. But the people that live here are terrifying warriors, and they will definitely kill us. So I've got a great idea. Let's go back to being slaves in Egypt." Only 2 of the spies say, "No, God brought us here. He promised us this land. He's going to look after us. We just need to trust him." One of those spies' names was Caleb, and the other was Joshua. Joshua is young at this point, but he is clearly courageous and faithful and already a leader in his tribe. But people don't listen to Joshua and Caleb. They refuse to trust God and enter Canaan, so God sends them to wander in the desert for 40 years. During that time, Joshua is Moses' apprentice. This might surprise you, but he was usually present when Moses and God would have their face-to-face conversations. Joshua also leads Israel in their very first battle of self-defense against some ambushing Amalekites. And at last, a very old Moses leads Israel back to the border of Canaan for a second chance of entering the promised land. And this time, the people trust God will keep his promise. And since Moses is about to die, Joshua is the one to lead them in. The Hebrew authors highlight here that Joshua is being set up as a new Moses. Like Moses, he urged Israel to trust God and keep his commands because they were their source of life. Like Moses, he sends spies into the land. And then, like the parting of the Red Sea, God holds back the water of the Jordan River, and the fighting men of Israel enter Canaan. What comes next is a whole series of violent battles, as Joshua and the Israelites drive out and destroy the Canaanites, the people already living there, men, women, and children. That is what God commanded them to do. That is so intense. If you are anything like me, this deeply troubled you when you first learnt it. Maybe it still does. Why would God command violence? Isn't he loving? Why not promise Israel some uninhabited piece of land and leave the Canaanites alone? These are fair questions. Before we tackle them, I want to take a moment just to be sensitive to the fact that today, over 3,000 years later, many of us have Palestine on our minds. In the last year, we have seen ongoing violence and oppression from the modern state of Israel, causing enormous suffering. I want to be clear, this war in the Middle East is absolutely not supported by any God-given mandate. Rather, it is human greed, spiraling revenge, and corrupt politics. God does not blindly side with any nation against the rest of the world. No, he holds us all to the same standards, as we will see in our story. So if you are angry about injustice happening today, God is angry along with you. And I just want you to remember that God's command to ancient Israel about conquering Canaan was a unique, specific, limited moment in history for God's specific purpose that we're about to talk about. Okay. Take a deep breath. We will come back to the violence question as we explore the story. But for now, let's rewind 3,400 years. Joshua leads Israel in a series of battles to conquer Canaan. Most of the battles are listed briefly, almost like bullet points. Here are all the cities Joshua conquered. But the first two battles are narrated in detail: the Battle of Jericho and the Battle of Ai. They are set up as a pair of case studies to make a point and give us insight into the bigger picture. When Joshua sent spies into the land, they met a Canaanite prostitute named Rahab who lived in Jericho. She surprisingly helped and hid the spies because she had come to believe that Israel's God was the one true God. This is what she said to them. "I know the Lord has given you this land," she told them. "We are all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror. For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of heavens above and the earth below." The spies promise to be kind to Rahab when God gives them the land. They make it back safely to Joshua, and not long after that, Israel marches on Jericho. They obey God's special instructions to simply march around the city, acknowledging that it is God fighting for them. And when God causes the city wall to collapse, Israel destroys the city and everyone in it. Well, almost everyone. In fact, not the entire city wall collapses. Rahab's house, which was part of the wall, remains standing, and her life and her family's lives are spared. God has mercy on her because of her belief in him. Now, at that battle, there was an Israelite man named Achan. He didn't see why it was necessary to devote all Jericho's plunder to God. Why not keep just a little for himself, he thought. And when the Israelites attack the second city, the city of Ai, they experience a terrible defeat. God does not fight for them. They retreat in terror, and Joshua falls on his face in dismay before God, who explains to Joshua what has happened. Achan's disobedience and unfaithfulness has to be severely dealt with before God will fight for Israel again. So this is a story of Israel's disobedience, and it makes clear they don't get special treatment compared to the Canaanites. Can you see how these stories are mirror images of each other? While Jericho was a story of victory and the saving faith of an outsider, i.e. Rahab, Ai is a story of defeat because of the unfaithfulness of an insider, Achan, who should have known better. What is the point here? The point is, this war is about God bringing justice on human evil wherever it is found, and rewarding faith with mercy wherever it is found. It is not ultimately about Israel versus Canaan. This is reinforced by Joshua's mysterious meeting with a mighty warrior. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as a commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Then Joshua fell down to the ground in reverence. So whether this epic army commander is an angel or an appearance of God in human form, he represents God himself. And when Joshua asks him whose side he is on, his reply is neither. This is not a human war where God is favoring one ethnicity over another. This is God's battle, and God is on his own side, the side of ultimate justice and ultimate mercy. Let's circle back to the question, why would God destroy the Canaanites? What's all this talk about bringing justice on evil? Let's think about how the Canaanites were living. We know a bit about this because in Leviticus 18 and Deuteronomy 12, God gives Israel explicit warnings not to behave like the Canaanites. We know from those chapters that Canaanite culture was overflowing with sexual perversion, incest, rape. They were burning their children to death as offerings to demons. Imagine if someone did those things today and was in the news. Do you think you would say, "Oh well, we all make mistakes"? Or would you want them to experience justice for their actions and be prevented from harming anyone else? The picture we get of Canaan is one of utter and settled corruption, perpetuated generation after generation. The fact that their moral corruption was so well established as to even be famous tells us that Canaan had been benefiting from God's patient mercy for a long time, but they had finally provoked him to anger. They deserved to experience God's justice long ago, but God, who is not willing that any should perish, was reluctant to destroy them as long as they might repent. The example of Rahab shows us that God was willing to save and show mercy to anyone who repented. So although this is a story about God bringing justice on human evil, it also gives us a hint that what he wants to give, what he is eager to give, is mercy. Don't just take my word on that. God tells Moses about his merciful nature in Exodus 34. This is how he describes himself. Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin. But I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even the 3rd and 4th generations. God is both completely just and completely merciful. Justice and mercy are both essential to his nature. But in this passage, notice how justice is something he does, and mercy is something he is. He says, I am the God of compassion and mercy. Notice that he gives the justice that is necessary, but lavishes love excessively, extravagantly, endlessly, because he wants to. Mercy and blessing is what God delights to give. In the words of the Puritan Bible scholars Thomas Goodwin and Jonathan Edwards, mercy is God's natural work. It flows from him spontaneously, while punishment and justice are his strange work. He is slow to anger and not willing that any should perish. Notice also the comparison between excusing and forgiving. I do not excuse the guilty, yet I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin. God cannot excuse or overlook sin. That would be unjust. But he does forgive sin. How? By absorbing justice himself. By coming as a human being to intercept the punishment. About 700 years after Joshua, but still 700 years before Jesus, Isaiah wrote this prophecy about how God would do this. He was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's paths to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. Wow. So that's pretty cool. 700 years before it happened, God already had a plan in place to send Jesus. Well, that plan was in fact already in place before even the first books of the Bible were written. The entire Old Testament points forward to the coming of the Messiah, the rescuer, God in human form, who would give us new hearts and save us from self-destruction. Joshua is one such example. He is a foreshadowing of Jesus. We see this in two ways. They have the same name, Yehoshua in Hebrew and Yeshua in Aramaic, both meaning Yahweh saves. And Joshua is described in a very unique way. It's said he has the spirit of wisdom. That word is only used twice in the Bible, once about Joshua and once in Isaiah's prophetic description of the Messiah. And Joshua is not the only person who foreshadows Jesus. Time and time again, God gives Israel leaders, and although they all fail and fall short, they collectively build up a portrait of what the coming Messiah would look like. For example, in Deuteronomy, God promises a prophet like Moses. The Lord said to Moses, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command them." So the people are expecting a new Moses. And Joshua seems to fit the bill, right? We saw before he was set up as a new Moses. The waters even part for him like they did for Moses. Is Joshua the Messiah? The writers of Deuteronomy answer this question. Immediately after Joshua is commissioned to lead Israel, the narrator tells us, "Dear reader, we're still waiting for that prophet like Moses." In other words, Joshua is not the guy. This is the very last line of the scroll of Deuteronomy, which is the last of the 5 scrolls of the Torah, Israel's foundational scriptures. So this is the cliffhanger of the entire Torah. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So when Jesus at last comes to Israel, they're still waiting for the Messiah, that prophet like Moses. They were expecting a confrontation of the oppressive powers, which for them was the empire of Rome. Just like Moses confronted Pharaoh, right? That's what they were expecting. But Jesus came to free us from much more than human oppression. He came to free us from the slavery of our own sinful hearts. And now all the signposts of the Old Testament make so much sense. Jesus is the new Adam who trusts God and passes the test. He is the new Joshua who has the spirit of wisdom. He is the new David whose kingdom will never end. He is the new Elijah who overcomes death. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that from his descendants would come a blessing for all the nations. Jesus fulfills all the foreshadowing. He is the perfection that all these flawed people point towards. The whole Bible points to Jesus as the ultimate embodiment of both God's holy judgment and self-sacrificial mercy. As he willingly died on a Roman cross, He bore the just punishment for all of our sin, so that he could joyfully, lavishly offer his mercy to everyone on earth, not so sin could be excused, but so it could be forgiven. I have a question for us to discuss at our tables, and it's this. How would things be different if God simply ignored sin? So we're going to have maybe 7 to 10 minutes to talk our tables, and then hopefully we'll get some feedback.